much. First and foremost, because I don't really have that much time, but I just have to automatically thank Tenacious V because, man, that was a tough act to follow. Man, that was really good. So one more for Tenacious V. My story actually takes place probably about 8 or 9 years ago in San Francisco, and it starts with a little boy named Danny Cho. And Danny, 10-year-old boy, nothing really stands out about him in a lot of ways. He's pretty good in school, doesn't have any trouble making friends or anything, but one thing that does stand out about Danny is he was born with no left arm. I mean, not even a shoulder. I mean, he had nothing over there, and to his credit, he didn't know what it was like to have a left arm. He'd done nothing but having just one arm. And like I said, I mean, he always had a good attitude, just a really good kid. But there was a lot of things that just most 10-year-old kids would take for granted that Danny just was not going to be able to do. Baseball was like huge in his school. All of his best friends, great baseball players. He went to all their games. He supported, but he's not going to be swinging a bat. You know, he can't catch and throw. Baseball's not going to work out for Danny. And his grandparents that raised him, they were always trying to find ways to kind of build his confidence. They were very aware that, you know, he was a good kid, but at the same time, you could tell he was not very confident in himself. And so they would always look for new ways to kind of raise his self-esteem a little bit. And his grandmother heard about judo. For those of us, anyone familiar with judo is a martial art involving throws. She'd heard that this might become something that might be interesting. So on a whim, his grandmother and Danny, they went to visit a judo studio. And just about as soon as they walked through the door, it's a busy class going on. And I mean, completely across the room, the headmaster of the studio sees Danny and right off the bat makes a beeline, walks immediately over, puts his hand out, say, "Hey, my name's Mr. Waller." He says, "What is your name?" He says, "Well, I'm Danny." He says, "Well, Danny, if you have a minute, I wonder if you would come over here to this corner of the mat. I just want to kind of work on a thing with you." And sure, why not? And so Danny and Miss Master Waller, they go over to the corner and they just start rolling around, and they roll around for almost a whole entire hour before finally Master Waller brings himself back over to grandmother, introduces himself. "How are you? I'm Master Waller. I run this studio. Listen, I got to tell you, I need Danny in here every single week. I'll train him for free, but he's got something that not everybody has. I'll do whatever I can just to make sure that Danny's here." And for Danny, I mean, this is incredible. I mean, every single teacher, every single coach that's ever seen Danny, they took one look at that arm and they say, they automatically think, well, how can I work around this? How can I make this work? He's never had somebody pursue him. He's never had somebody look at him and say, "Please, I need to work with you." This is a bona fide judo master who is asking permission to work with this guy. And I mean, Danny's completely blown away. And so they show up the next week, and he and Master Waller spend the entire hour working on just one move. Over and over again they work with, and Danny is just in love. And they come back the next week, and the next week. He's been doing it for a month, and for this month solid, Master Waller and Danny spend an hour a week working on one move over and over and over again. And Danny, great attitude, of course, and this great admiration for Master Waller, but he's 10 years old. I mean, his attention span is not great. He says, I really like this move, Master Waller, but I think I'm ready to try some other stuff. And Master Waller says, no. He says, no, we're going to master that move. You and I are going to keep on working on that until you are an absolute master of that move. And that was enough for Danny, so he stayed religious with it. Every single week, they worked on this one move over and over and over again, every week for 6 months. And finally, poor Danny is about to snap. He says, Master Waller, we've been working on it. I feel like I've mastered that move. I'm really ready to learn some other stuff. And Master Waller says, "You know what, Danny? You're right. You have mastered that move. That's why I've entered you into a judo tournament." And Danny is completely blown away because how can I compete against all these other kids who've been training for all this time? They've done how many moves? I only know one move. How can I compete against that? And Master Waller says to him, "Danny, you've mastered that move. If you trust in your move, I guarantee you none of those kids can beat you." And Danny, I mean, he loves Master Waller, so you know what? I'm going to do my best, but let's be honest. Danny understands what's going on. Those kids have countless moves. He's got one. So Danny enters the tournament. First round, as soon as it begins, ding, Danny has wrapped this kid up, throwing him right on the back. The match is over just as soon as it's begun. He moves on to the next round, being the exact same thing. Really, it takes no time at all, and Danny's just blown through. He goes all the way through into the finals, and the kid in the finals is an absolute bruiser. We all went to school with that kid who was supposed to be 10, but he had a hairy chest. You've seen that kid before. That's the kid that's in the final, and he's won this tournament 3 years in a row. He's got 3 years of experience. Danny has 6 months and one move. And Danny, he's done so good, but man, this kid is something else. He's not like the other kids. And Master Waller says to him one more time, he says, Danny, you have mastered that move. Trust me that if you trust in your move, you are unbeatable. And so Danny went into it. The match begins, and ding, and Danny has just won. He beat that bruiser kid just like everyone. And when they hand Danny, thank you, Danny's not here, but when they hand Danny that trophy, now really try to imagine that moment of whoever knew Danny and said, one day they're going to be giving you a championship trophy for an athletic accolade like that. Whoever saw that in Danny's future? But here he is. He's done it, and he's earned it 100%. Against kids, every one of them had twice as many arms as he did. He's earned that, and with tears, he hands that to Master Waller, and he says, you were right. He says, I trusted in my one move, and I beat all those kids like it was nothing. He says, I don't even understand. And Master Waller finally tells him what he saw in Danny. The very first time I saw you, Danny, I saw that you had something none of those kids can. He said, did it ever occur to you? He says, the only way to counter that move was to grab your left arm. And that's why Master Waller is the hero of the story, because just like for kids, you see, why that story changed my life when my mentor told me that story. He says, because just like for kids, Master Waller saw instantly something great in Danny that nobody else could recognize. And maybe even Danny was not going to be able to recognize on his own. But for kids, what it's about is about finding those kids who everyone has told them what's holding them back. Everything that's their greatest weakness really is going to be ending up being their greatest strength. And that's why Master Waller and 4 Kids are my heroes.